This week on Forward. One of the calling cards of independence is that they want to be independent. They don't particularly want to join. They don't want something to be said about. You know, it's like, oh, I'm an independent because I don't want to be wearing a team's colors. You know, one of the things that's both good and bad, generally bad about our politics is it's essentially become like a contest of vibes or energy.
Yeah.
You know, in part because I think the policy positions at this point have become abstractions of themselves. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the podcast. You might know her as the co-author of The Canceling of the American Mind and the host of the podcast, We Never Had This Conversation.
Yep. Forthcoming.
Forthcoming. Welcome back, Rikki Schlott.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be back here.
Yeah, so we have a mini tradition going, Rikki, which is before an election day.
Yeah. We're 2 for 2 since we've met. Yeah.
Yes. And so now here we are. It's that time again. I can't believe that a couple of years have flown. Unfortunately, now prognostications, I mean, anyone can look at the numbers and they see that it's going to be dicey. But you and I were just sharing before we started recording. I'll just share it myself first. Like, I've had kind of a grim feeling of foreboding for quite some time. And one of the things I've been trying to parse is that there were months and months when, you know, we thought Joe Biden was the nominee, which I obviously thought was a terrible idea. And
I was with you on that one for sure.
And so I was like, oh, this is like a guaranteed Trump return. Like, no wonder I feel so lousy about our prospects. And so I got on the pass the torch bandwagon, or, you know, started it a little bit. I guess I wasn't really a bandwagon rider. And so then he steps aside, which I applauded. And then Kamala takes over. And then Kamala has this surge of energy and momentum and raises a truck ton of money. And then I start to think, like, my gosh, and we can talk, you know, I mean, I don't know where you are on Kamala. But I was like, wow, like maybe we are going to avoid a Trump return.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was just like the relief of not Biden, but not so specifically like the joy wave due to Kamala herself. That was kind of my sense. Even among my friends, it was just like, thank God it's not 2 old white men again. But I didn't really know a lot of people who were like, oh, and thank God it's her also. I agreed with you, and we talked about this a while back, that I really think the Democrats made a massive mistake by not doing a primary of some sort, because especially for young voters like myself who've never voted in an election that wasn't just like a lesser of 2 evils, everyone feels compromised sort of situation, that was an opportunity to really feel like, wow, we have buy-in, we chose this person, even if I don't like the person who ends up to be the candidate. Like I participated in democracy, which is supposedly what we do in this country. So I think it's kind of the consequence of the fact that a lot of people felt like it was kind of a coronation, and we were kind of excited at first that it wasn't Joe Biden. I mean, I think she's objectively, at least in my view and in everyone that I've spoken to, like a better candidate than Joe Biden right now. But why is it her in particular is sort of the vibe that I'm picking up and what I feel myself as well.
Well, sure. So now, as we're having this conversation, you'd say it's a 50-50 shot at one of them winning. And I've had very depressing conversations. Maybe this is why I'm still sad. So someone said to me, hey, if Trump loses, he's going to say he won, and then we'll see violence and protests around the country. And everyone, I think, can clearly see that as like an in-character move. But then the person said something that also made me sad, is that, and if Trump wins, there will be a lot of violence against migrants and other people, because people will be like, okay, we're back, and let's and I hadn't really thought about that scenario until this person said it to me, but then I thought about it and I was like, oh, maybe she's right.
Well, I also think if you think back to like 2020 and the kind of COVID situation and then the lead up to the 2020 election, I don't think all the windows in New York City and all the storefronts were boarded up for conservatives rioting in New York. I think it was in case there was a Trump election. So I do think that there is potentially like a repeat of 2020 left-wing rioting too if Trump wins as well.
Yeah, let's explore that. So I was sort of thinking, like laughing, is that I felt like a lot of, if there are riots on that side, like it would seem opportunistic to me in the sense that it's like, hey, let's steal some things because
I mean, like it was kind of the last time around
like
as well.
There's a situation of unrest. So let me play this out because I think there's a very real chance that Trump just wins straight up. Like he wins the Electoral College. I think he loses the popular. So as we're having this conversation, here's what the forecast would be. It could go either way in the presidential. The Republicans probably win the Senate by a seat or two, and then the Democrats probably win the House by like a slim margin. So let's say Trump wins the Electoral College. I think that Kamala does concede. I think that this isn't like a, hey, we we're and I mean, if there are grounds, like Bush v. Gore style, where it ends up going to something contested or a recount or something along those lines, that I'm sure they pursue it. But if it's clear that, look, he edges it out in Michigan or Pennsylvania, and then wins the Sun Belt states, and then Trump wins, Kamala concedes. There's certainly a hue and cry from the left, but for whatever reason, and this is one of the reasons why I think I've been saddened, is that if you remember Trump wins in 2016, people are kind of surprised. Hillary, loses, and then there's like March on Washington, and like those like the versions of the lefty protests, and then there's 4 years of very adverse coverage, I would say, of Trump. So it's like getting people up all the time, and then Trump loses barely to Joe, and then he comes back. The strange thing about this, Rikki, is I think when someone asked me at this point months and months ago, said, hey, what do you think happens in the U.S.? I said the most likely scenario is we slump into autocracy. And one of the reasons I said that was because I think that there would eventually be just like they want it so bad, let them have it kind of feeling. And if Trump wins legitimately, and I think there's a very real chance he just wins legitimately, I'm not sure you see the hue and cry on the other side. I think you see this kind of exhaustion and like certainly like a lot of how did we get here? Who screwed up? Like there'd probably be some like turning on, like some decisions that the Harris campaign made at some point. I'm trying to imagine whether there are the kinds of protests, because I felt like the 2020 protests were more born of George Floyd COVID era than like a. I'm even trying to remember the response to Trump's victory in 2016, which seemed like one more of disbelief. That
was disbelief for sure. But then also, like, when I think back to 2016, when you say that there would be a lot of like turning inwards on the left, I feel like the failure of the left in the wake of Trump's victory was the Democrats did not spend enough time saying, how did we alienate this many voters? What is happening in middle America with middle class white people feeling like they're not being heard in the same way? What is Trump tapping into that we're failing to tap into? But instead it was like deplorable, bad, can't listen to them, can't hear what they have to say. And like that was the moment for introspection. So I mean, I would love if Trump wins this time, if the left would look inwards and say, how can we actually reach back out to these voters that we've somehow alienated, and to the point that they're voting for Donald Trump. I mean, I don't think everyone that votes for Trump is super gung-ho about it. I think there are a massive plurality of people who just feel like this is my choice between the two people. But I mean, Ron DeSantis had like a really hot streak. Nikki Haley had a large plurality of Republicans behind her that preferred her as a much more establishment person to Trump. So I worry that in the past, the Democrats have really not shown an instinct to look inwards and to reach outwards to the people that did not vote for them.
Totally agree on that. And one of the things that drives me nuts, and this drove me nuts when Joe was the nominee in particular, where there were some Dems that would literally say something like, we'll get them in 28.
Yeah.
Something like that. And then my honest feeling was like, are you sure that there are going to be elections the way that we're used to them in 28? And then people think, so my general thesis over the last number of years has been that there's like this institutional decay and degradation. And you're seeing that in ways big and small. It's one reason why I think Trump has a real chance to win this, is that the orneriness is high, the disillusionment is high, the you're full of it is high.
Yeah.
And then the Democratic media machine and the positivity message, I think, is falling on deaf ears more and more. People like, look, and people should know. I mean, I think if you're listening to this, you know, I mean, I endorse Kamala. I'm like a never Trump guy. And so, you know, the rest of it. But there are a lot of folks around me that are out on the Democrats. And I get that. I felt at the time that they lost to Trump because they sandbagged Bernie, that if Bernie had been the nominee, which should have happened in my opinion, like, you know, just based on the will of the people. like if Bernie was the Democratic nominee, I think Bernie beats Trump. And then we're in a different world. And then some people are like, oh, I hate Bernie. It's like, you know, legitimately, like, you know, I thought that the DNC put their thumb on the scale for Hillary. And then that got me fired up enough to run for president the next cycle, because I was like, you know what, there's this Trump decay. It is based upon the gutting of various manufacturing communities and the rest of this stuff. And you're not seeing that conversation happening in Democratic circles. You're not seeing the AI conversation happen in Democratic circles, which I saw was coming down the pike. Yeah. And so I said, let me try and help. And my message was, and like, to your point, like, my message actually got picked up by a lot of Trump voters or Trump sympathetic voters. They're like, oh, this guy is like talking about, you know, real things. And so they were open to it. Now, I didn't win, obviously. And then Joe Biden did win. And they've done a lot of things that are sort of slow moving in terms of policy, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really an infrastructure act, and a bunch of other things.
Which didn't actually do much for inflation.
Yeah. I mean, it did the usual naming convention. And so to the extent that there has been like a lack of self-examination, I mean, the Democrats did not have a real primary, and they should have with Joe. I mean, heck, I backed Dean Phillips. Did you talk to Dean during that time?
Yeah, I did. I met him a few times. I think I interviewed him once I did interview him once for the Post as well. I mean, I really liked Dean. I mean, I think the name recognition thing was really his biggest issue. I mean, I wanted to get behind pretty much anybody else constantly in this election. Like, RFK really let me down, like the bear cub and the whale head and the affairs, and like, just, he was too messy of a character, but I wanted to be behind him. Like, I mean, it's disappointing. I mean, even the no labels thing I wanted to be behind too, but then they were, in my opinion, more beholden to whatever interests were going to have them select their candidate, rather than have a primary and trust the voters to use what I think was actually some meaningful infrastructure with ballot access that they had built up.
Yeah, they invested a lot in that freaking ballot access.
That disappointed me too. I mean, I so far I'm just like, nothing is really how I would like it to be right now.
Hello, YouTube. Please do hit that like and subscribe button. And don't forget, you can ask questions at mailbag@andrewyang.com. See you on the interwebs. So that's giving rise to your kind of bad feeling?
I mean, my bad feeling too. I share your concern that's reflected in your book of political violence. And I remember the first time that Trump was shot, like, you were one of the first people that I thought of, because I read your book that like kind of sees that coming down the pipeline in this very election. And I thought that was going to be a more meaningful, even when I knew he was going to survive, I thought that would be like a more lasting conversation in our discourse. It almost feels like that was just like a couple days and then something else happened and we forgot about it.
Yeah, it was very, very dark. Like, you thought, well, this is serious and should have a lasting impact. Yeah. And in 72 hours, we kind of moved on.
Yeah. Was it that Biden dropped out right after or something? Something big. I can't remember the chronology, but something big happened like within a couple days, and then our like social media brains were like, okay, that now.
Yeah, I think it was Joe dropping out.
Yeah. But, you know, I'm curious. This is a very morbid question. It's not like me wishing anything at all. I think assassination attempts are horrendous and have no place in American politics. That should go without saying. But like, what do you think would have actually happened if that had been a successful attempt? I can't even imagine what would have happened.
Well, let's hope that, you know, we don't have to live through that sort of thing.
Of course.
But I think there would have been violence, a lot of violence.
Yeah.
Regardless of the motivations of the individual.
Yeah.
Which in that case are still, I believe, unclear. And
which is amazing to me.
Political. But if you'd have someone like a presidential candidate get assassinated, then the other side would get blamed regardless of the motivations of the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would have had a real conflagration, in my opinion, just like widespread response. And these are things that I underestimated for a long time in my life. Like because maybe it's because of who I am. It's just that you don't think that things react in ways that strike you as. I'm like, when people talk about the culture, or it has become more true with social media, unfortunately, where you think people react in certain ways, you'd be like, oh, are people really going to react that way? And then now you're seeing it, I think, in large part because of the social media movements. They're like, oh my gosh, people really do respond in those ways. I think there would have been some significant violence. I'm not sure what would have happened to the Republican ticket. As I think on it, at that moment, I believe J.D. Vance had just been named or something along those lines.
Yeah. No, Vance was after. Vance was definitely after, because I almost wondered if the Vance choice was not somehow psychologically tied to the assassination attempt with Trump, where he was the yes man, dig your heels in MAGA character versus someone like a Burgum that would have been the kind of appeasing the moderates sort of thing, and who I think would have been much more advisable, who I've met in person, who is, I think, a really nice and impressive guy. But I wondered very specifically whether Trump picked Vance just because he had just gone through that experience. It was I think a couple of days later that he picked Vance. Yeah, I think you're right. And I at the time, it seemed like Trump was going to steamroll to a victory, and he could have picked anyone he wanted. And I think that was part of the reason why J.D. Vance. And then there was a minute when people were like, oh, that was really not very wise, before J.D. Vance found his footing. I think the debate really gave me a relatively more positive view of Vance. Well, what it did is it let you know that the guy's smart. Yeah, the guy's smart. And that to me was also a brief vision of what politics would look like without Trump. Well, so someone asked why the VP debate was so collegial. And what I said to them was that Tim Walz is from Minnesota, and there is such a thing as Minnesota nice. They're genuinely very, very cordial people. And J.D. Vance's mission was to try and bring the edges in and make himself seem. So you put those two together, and all of a sudden, but it was a better version of politics. I got numerous messages saying I prefer this to the presidential ticket. This is what it was, in part because they're both. J.D. Vance is freaking legit young. I think he might be. He's 39, I think. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So and he's very, very well spoken, and Tim Walz is still with it. He's not. But you're not worried about his mental faculties. So on the, and they genuinely seemed solutions oriented. They genuinely seemed like, hey, here's a problem. And neither of them are also battered down from really being in the national eye in the same way that Kamala, Biden, Trump are right now. And that's true. I wonder if particularly with Vance, I wonder if in 4 years he'll have that same sort of ability to hold himself back and hold in the edges, like you said. I'm not sure. One of the things I heard that made me very, very aggravated. So Tim Walz gets named the running mate, and then there's a celebration. And then he doesn't do a whole lot of press for quite some time. And what I heard was that the Dems kept him under wraps because Kamala wasn't doing a lot of press, and they didn't want to make her look bad. And then I heard that, and I was like, and apparently, that came from multiple folks. And I suppose the person, I trust their sourcing. Let's put it that way. Okay. And when I heard it, I was like, wow, that's really frustrating if that was their approach. But then it rang of something that I would believe. Fair enough. Of the Democrats, and it's so the arc of their media exposure has been Kamala was doing very, very few interviews leading up to the debate, performed strongly at the debate, and then I thought at that point they'd be like, okay, have at it. And then it was still somewhat limited.
And then more recently now they're like, okay, like hang it, like we've got to set her loose and like have her do media. I think they're doing the same with Tim Walz. But of course now we're literally like, a couple weeks and like, X days away. So if you have your candidate under wraps, I will say that I think that it's also being borne out by the numbers, which is they had an uptick and then they plateaued in this essentially like 50-50 deadlock. They have raised and spent a majority of $1 billion and it hasn't really moved the numbers. And this is one of the things that I find so, and you know this about me. So someone said to me the other day, it's like, how did we wind up here? And what I said is, well, if you have a two-party system where each side starts out with 45% of the vote, like you wind up with something like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Totally. Absolutely.
And that's like it's like a recipe for some very bad government and bad leadership.
Absolutely. I mean, I think even her first interview that she did was with Tim Walz, just like sitting over her shoulder for some reason.
That was a weird interview to me.
That was really strange, the optics of that. But I mean, I also think part of that strategy might have been that there was just what I think wasn't a totally rational reaction to her being named just because we were so beaten down by a second like Biden-Trump that everyone was like coconut pilled and Kamala pilled for like 2 weeks. And I feel like the campaign was like, maybe she won't, like, she actually hasn't been doing that much out in the press. She wasn't that popular when she was vice president. Maybe we should keep her back because she's not that popular when she starts talking. But then I also think that it just kind of wears off because like, what were we really that excited about is what I keep hearing from my friends who like were pretty gung-ho and maybe still I mean, everyone that I know what that was gung-ho is still going to vote for her, but not in the same like, thank God I can go to the ballot and vote for Kamala. It's just like not voting for Trump basically is what she's become the stand-in for. She's no longer, I think, in the public eye, this like exciting, flashy new entity.
Yeah, I think there was this rush of relief and energy and then it did kind of wear thin a little bit. And then now they're having to replace it with reality. This podcast is sponsored by Helix Sleep. What can you do that's going to make you happier, healthier, more energetic throughout the day? There's not much, but you know what really, really could make that kind of difference? Investing in a proper mattress. That's what I did with a Helix Sleep mattress. I took their personalized sleep quiz. I got a Dawn Firm mattress sent to my door. And not only has it made a difference in my health and energy, but it's also become my kids' favorite mattress, even though it wasn't ordered with them in mind. Maybe it's because they love me so much. No, it's actually because the mattress is better. And if you don't take my word for it, GQ, Wired, everyone agrees that Helix Sleep is the mattress pick if you want a better night's sleep. Helix is offering 20% off all mattress orders for our listeners. Go to helixsleep.com/yang. That's helixsleep.com/yang. With Helix, better sleep starts now. I try and focus on some of the opportunities. One opportunity I'm super excited about is a guy named Dan Osborne who's running for Senate in Nebraska as an independent. I don't know if you've seen this race.
No, I haven't.
It's so fun, Rikki. So, I mean, you're obviously somewhat independent sympathetic where you were like looking for.
Oh, yeah. I'm a registered independent. Definitely.
Candidate. So I'm likewise disappointed that there hasn't been a standard bearer at the presidential level, but the standard bearer at the Senate level is a guy named Dan Osborne who's running as an independent in Nebraska against a Republican incumbent who, so that I guess she said she would only serve 2 terms and this would be her 3rd term. So it gives you a sense of it.
Yeah.
And he's neck and neck with her. He's a U.S. Navy veteran, mechanic. I've now spent some time with him. I'm heading to Nebraska, actually, to campaign with him. And all you have to do is like watch 30-second video, and you're just like, I know who this guy is, because he's a mechanic who served in the Navy and has
Very
tattoos
cool.
on his arms and is like, I'm an independent. Like, politicians should wear should wear the corporate logos of all their sponsors on them, like a NASCAR jacket. He's like, I'm not that guy. And so I can totally see Nebraskans seeing this guy being like, I know who this guy is too, and I prefer that. He also happens to be pro-choice, and it's like to me, like this is one of the most interesting opportunities, and so I'm taking solace in the fact that I can go gung ho and like particular races. I mean, I'm going to be doing some things to try and elevate the sensible independent vote in places like Pennsylvania that could have a huge effect on the ultimate outcome in November. But there does seem like the major outcomes. I feel like a Senate race, if we can get someone like Dan Osborne to Senate, like when the smoke clears and people figure out what happened on election day, if someone looked up and said, what, there's an independent who's a senator from Nebraska, and looked him up, like that would be a big win.
Yeah, absolutely. What about, are there any states or any like local measures with like ballot measures on open primaries?
Yes, I want you to ask. So these are the other super exciting things. There are 6 states that are considering opening up their primaries, and the good guys, our friends at Unite America, are deploying tens of millions of dollars of various philanthropic and donor resources to try and change the primaries in Nevada, which would be the second vote. It won 53-47 last time. Colorado, Arizona, Idaho, South Dakota, Montana, and then also Oregon's voting on ranked choice voting statewide.
Oh, wow.
So
awesome.
You could, and I talked to folks who are in the know in these states, and they say they're all close.
Okay.
So just like you have 7 swing states, and the swing states, some are closer than others, where you'd kind of be surprised if the Dems won North Carolina, for example. But but the reform efforts, it's similar. You have 7 states, and they're all close.
And do you think that like the major barrier to that is just lack of like public awareness around what it really means, or are there actual like meaningful counter arguments against it that you think voters are coming to the ballot box with?
I mean, I think it is a voter education thing, because most voters, if you say to them, for example, in Nevada, how would you like to vote for whomever you like in the primary? And voters like, sounds pretty good. And then the parties will try and scare them and be like, oh, it's going to be too confusing. It's like literally they use things like that. They say it's going to be too confusing if you can vote for whomever you want. The arguments against it are really pretty lousy. Like the fundamental real kind of argument is it would give us, the parties, less control. And there are vested interests who look at that and say, oh, I don't like that because it would diminish my clout. Like if you have a lot of sway within one party or the other, then you like the system as is, because you're like, hey, everyone has to answer to me. Now that is never going to be, a majority of the people in the state. Though I will say one of the things that scares the reform community is that if someone drops $3 million of negative advertising saying, hey, this is really bad, like voters will retreat to the status quo.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And if you send something out there unsupported, where there is no education campaign or advertising campaign, it will also generally lose unless it's just so obvious, which this is not, because it's sort of technical seeming. Like of these measures, it's a very, very rare segment that you could just roll it out there and the voters would look at it and be like, oh, I know what that is, and would vote yes on it. Like there was one in California around like internet privacy or whatnot. It was like, hey, do you want more control of your data and other things? And I think like voters chose that one. Okay, that makes sense. Like pretty clean. But these sorts of reforms you need to bankroll. And then if voters understand what they are. So I'll give you an example of something very sad and dark. So Alaska is kind of my poster child for this. There are some ultra conservatives in Alaska who are trying to repeal the change to the primaries ranked choice voting. It's like, we like the old system better because they had more control. And apparently that's going to go down to the wire.
Oh, wow. Really? And that's on the ballot?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Huh. That's disappointing.
Yeah, right.
That's a bummer.
So there are folks in the reform community who, they go through the offense states, but then they say, what's really important is defense in Alaska, because if Alaska undoes it, then it would be very, very negative. And there's the woman who beat Sarah Palin, Mary Peltola, is in like a 50-50 re-election race. Okay. Right now, and she's, in my opinion, one of like the emblems of like what happens if you reform the system, and so like there's like a high level of stress in the reform community around this. When I sat with them, they were like, they think that each of them could go either direction. Hey all, if you know me, you know I'm not that handy in the kitchen, and I have become a huge believer and booster of Factor. Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals make eating a joy. It's so fast. You just pop that thing 2 minutes later, and you are eating a restaurant-quality, healthy meal, making you feel excellent about yourself. My favorite is the turkey chili with zucchini, and there is so much more to choose from. You never get tired of it. It fits any budget. It's fast, healthy. It is going to be the new Factor in your life. Yes, I'm a fan. Head to factormeals.com/yang50 and use code yang50 to get 50% off your first box and 2 free wellness shots per box while subscription is active. That's code yang50 at factormeals.com/yang50 to get 50% off your first box. Get Factor today. It's going to change the way you eat.
And what about just in the general election right now? Do you have a gut sense of which way it's going to go?
Well, I mean, my gut sense is that Trump wins, because my thinking is that the polling undercounted his support in 2016. Mm-hmm. I think it undercounted his support in 2020 too, because I thought Biden had like a modest but consistent lead going in, and then all of a sudden it came down to 43,000 voters in 3 states, and this time it's neck and neck, and I think we're in a worse mood. I think the anti-institutional sentiment is higher now than it was. And so like I would be surprised. Now, I consider myself an objective, like concrete numbers guy. And so like I shouldn't be surprised. I mean, because you're looking at a coin flip. And so I shouldn't be surprised if Kamala wins, because that's as likely an outcome as the other. Mm-hmm. But I will say that I would be surprised.
You feel that right now the anti-institutional sentiment is greater than in 2020?
Yeah, I do.
Like, in what sense?
Well, I think generally speaking, it's getting worse and worse is one thing. But if you look at, let's say, for example, the media landscape now versus 2020, I think it's more fragmented. I think that even come election day 2020, there was still like a lot of confusion around COVID and the vaccines. And then fast forward to now, and now you can look back and say like, oh, some of those decisions, like I actually really have a problem with now. And so there's like a greater skepticism of institutions now than there was even a few years ago.
Because maybe I'm coming from it from like the opposite, like kind of political tribe a little bit, where I feel like, at least in the circles that I move in, I think it was worse in 2020 when, or at least in the election era, in kind of my group, when there was skepticism about like vaccine mandates and lockdown still, and that was very fresh in our minds. And like Rogan's exploding as a new character, and a lot of people I think were newly woken up to, like, on the right or independent sphere, to being skeptical of institutions.
Agree.
But then a lot of those same people, and I feel like myself included sometimes, have let some of the things that I think went wrong in 2020 become kind of memory hole things, because we just don't really want to think about it, and life's a little bit more normal now. Like, we don't really want to think about the lockdowns. We don't really want to think about the 2020 kind of shit show with the protests and the riots, and like we're going to kind of pretend that never happened. And I almost feel like there's some subset of people that just want things to go back to normal and maybe are not as inflamed in their anti-institutional sentiment as they possibly were. Like maybe I'm thinking kind of like the Rogan cohort type people as they were 4 years ago, because it's just more convenient not to think about it.
Oh, so I think human nature would bear out what you're describing. My question is, do you think those people are more likely to vote for Kamala Harris and when they show up to the ballot box because they'll be like, hey, like I just want to forget some of the stuff and like let's keep normalcy going?
I think it's for some people, yeah. Like I think that I can imagine a lot of, I mean, I wouldn't say that like Kamala Harris is really like the steward of like the most normal era of American politics by any means. But I feel like there were a lot of people that like maybe kind of got into like a knee-jerk reaction to voting for Trump because a lot of the like overzealous COVID responses and stuff were coming from the left in general, who I also might fall into the category of people who are just really frustrated of seeing like two old guys again, and who were really animated by anti-Biden sentiment, who might just say like, I'm going to toss my vote that way. But even among like people that I know that are truly disaffected, I do get a sense that the people who were among the people who were just not going to vote if it was another Trump-Biden election, who just thought like this is so beyond unbelievable and anti-democratic, some of them are going to, I think, show up for Kamala because it's just a different option that they were desperate for. So I feel like I'm holding out a little bit of like a chance that I'm leaning slightly towards, I think Kamala wins.
I spoke to Frank Luntz, who it seemed like leaned slightly towards Kamala winning.
Okay. And what was his reasoning? He
thought that the American people had never voted in someone like Donald Trump circa 2024, who had like this many legal issues, this many behavioral problems, this much of a track record. He's just like, he's never done it, and he doesn't think that we're able to start doing it. I mean, I certainly hope that you're right and Frank's right. And there have been days where I felt pretty optimistic about Kamala's chances, like, ooh, I think Kamala's going to win. And then today I'm obviously in the other camp, but I'd say 60% of the time I've been like, oh, I think Trump's going to win. And one of the reasons I think Trump's going to win is that there are some people that I know and respect that are voting for him or backing him in a way that I was like, like that's a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
And I remember in 2016, by the way, I mean, I posted something that really summed up my feeling about a lot of them. I was like, look, I get the frustration. I just don't think Trump's the answer. And like that, I know a lot of people who are frustrated with certain elements of various things and have like talked themselves into backing Trump, which again, I disagree with. But I remember in 16, none of these people would have been backing Trump. I mean, even 2020, and this is something, you have to like rewind and be like, really? Like Elon endorsed me in 2020. And, today he's going hard at Trump rallies. And I just think like, holy cow, like there are a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of the folks who've gone that direction, it's just a product of this two-party system where you have, these two universes. And in many of their cases, they've been antagonized by the left universe. And so then they look up and be like, all right, I guess I'm part of the other universe now.
Yeah, I mean, if you like even indicate that you're right-leaning in the slightest, you get skewered by the media if you're like an Elon or an Ackman or someone like that. But like both of them were on Twitter Spaces with like Dean Phillips, right? Like they were both looking for something else. I agree with you that it's like people, once it became clear that Trump and Biden were, or Trump and Kamala were going to be the choices. I mean, I'm surprised by how many people just fall into line on their sides, and like that's just the end of the story.
Frank suggested to me, it's like, and I appreciated Frank, but Frank was like, hey, you should run because then you would create this other column. And then I say, it's like, look, I obviously considered it. It's just that like I think I wind up in the same trap where like I'm a spoiler, and then it's like, oh, what am I going to do? I'm going to endorse one of these two. I mean, if I went full steam ahead, I probably would increase the chances of, in this case, Trump winning, which I thought was the most likely scenario. And then it's like I'm supposed to be the math guy. I'm not going to do that. But it is, I think that there's like a whole segment of Trump supporters that if you did have this third lane, they'd be like, I'll take that. Like they're not that pumped about Trump.
Yeah. And actually, I think there's this new cohort of like Kamala, because she's not Trump voters, that would also probably go for a third lane too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, the third lane definitely exists. The question is, how big is it? So your being an independent puts you in company with about half of all Americans.
Yeah.
So, you're going to be just riding the wave. But the question is whether that shows up in our politics, the ballot box, at a level like the presidential. And I certainly think that the odds of it just keep on going up and up. I've talked to you before about this idea of the independent primary, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, like that they're one of these cycles, the independent movement will get its act together and we'll have a primary, and then there'll be folks who participate, and there'll be its own set of debates. And then I have a feeling that people will find that very, very invigorating.
Absolutely.
This podcast is sponsored by ExpressVPN. How did you choose which internet service provider to use? The sad thing is, most of us didn't have much of a choice because ISPs operate a lot like monopolies in the regions that they serve. They then use this monopoly position to take advantage of customers, and yes, they even sell your data, your activities to advertisers and big tech companies, and you don't see a dime. That's why I protect my internet surfing and devices with ExpressVPN. When you use ExpressVPN, it's like a magic portal to a perfectly safe and anonymous internet. And don't take my word for it. This is the #1 VPN service according to CNET. It's used by major companies all over the world. So stop handing over your personal data to ISPs and other tech companies who then mine your activity and sell off your information. Protect yourself with a VPN I trust to keep my privacy online. Visit expressvpn.com/yang. That's expressvpn.com/yang to get 3 extra months free. Go to expressvpn.com/yang right now to learn more.
One question that I do have for you on that I've been curious about, and I think you're the perfect person to ask, is like, I feel like sometimes in our discourse, independent gets coded as moderate in a way that I'm not sure is fully accurate all the time. Like I can imagine perhaps, like, for example, on the Israel-Palestine issue, there might be a new cohort of independents who revoked their registration as Democrats in protest for Palestine or something like that. And I don't know that they necessarily have a lot in common with, like, maybe one of, like, a former Trump supporter who's a never Trumper now. And like, is that like, if there is a true independent coalition and it's not necessarily a moderate coalition, is it an even harder, like, hodgepodge of people and beliefs to hold down under one ticket? Or like, how does that look to you? Is that a legitimate challenge, or am I just thinking about fringy people on the way extremes?
No, it's a legitimate challenge for sure. And one of the calling cards of independence is that they want to be independent. They don't particularly want to join. They don't want something to be said about. It's like, oh, I'm an independent because I don't want to be wearing a team's colors. And then if you have me support this particular person, am I going to then be like responsible for all their positions, some of which I might not agree with? So it's going to be like an ongoing challenge. One of the things that's both good and bad, generally bad, about our politics is it's essentially become like a contest of vibes or energy. Yeah. In part because I think the policy positions at this point, and this is one of the things that does make me very sad in American life, is like the policies have become abstractions in themselves. It's like, hey, let's say I reduce child poverty by half, which the government did do in 2021. And then, like, does that cause everyone to be happier? And, I mean, in real life it did, but, like, it's like it never happened. Yeah. And so one of my suggestions in this space is someone like Mark Cuban, who I see as a combination of a bunch of elements. I think that that's what you'd wind up with in a very interesting fashion in an independent primaries. You'd have different profiles and energies. One of the other problems with it, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of people don't get involved in politics nowadays, is that you made a reference that if someone says they're right-leaning, then the establishment media will shiv them and like call them names and so which they totally will.
Same is true on the conservative media too, on the flip side as well. If someone takes a left-leaning position, they get skewered very similarly, I will admit.
And I've seen a few examples of that. Though I will say the left seems like it's made a sport of it to, almost like a higher level. But the same is even true for folks who don't swear fealty to the Democratic Party in a particular way. Like I'm an independent. I think I'm a fairly positive human, but like that they like continuously project bad intentions on anyone who's not wearing the jersey. As a matter of fact, I actually think they even project bad intentions on the people who are wearing the jersey if they're like wearing it slightly wrong or, or like,
That's true.
And so one of the challenges when you're talking about this independence is that if someone says they're independent, Democrats immediately see that as oppositional to them in a way that's like, and I actually don't think it's the same on the other side. Like, I don't think Republicans see themselves as, and I'll give you exhibit A on this. And one reason why I think Trump may win is RFK.
Yeah.
So RFK has his campaign, does have a following. He reaches out to both the Kamala team and the Trump team. And then the Harris team won't take a meeting.
Yeah.
Won't sit down with him.
Yeah.
And it's partially because they spent months, pillorying him in the press through their, attack machine. But like they're not really trying to add to the coalition in that way. And then Trump was like, "Oh, what you want to be on like a health commission?" It's like, sure,
just Maha now instead of MAGA. And
there
you go.
Like do that. And I think that's a real weakness on the Democratic side. That it was right there for them.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Especially because I think RFK is probably realistically more policy aligned with Kamala, if it really comes down to it, than Trump.
On many things, I believe you are right. Even if you take their flagship issue, it's like, hey, let's try and make food healthier, which I agree with. And like, I'm sure there are all sorts of additives that other countries have done a better job with. But then you think to yourself, okay, like which party would be more keen on regulating what goes into food? And you'd think it'd be the Democrats, because Republicans are typically not exactly, and so that was like a little bit of a missed opportunity. And I think that it's one of the challenges if you do this independent primary, then it seems kind of anti-institutional. And right now, the way these parties are set up, it's like the Democrats are the institutional party, Republicans are the somewhat anti-institutional party. And then if you're an independent in a particular way, like I'm an independent in a way that's like, look, I don't want to, I think these institutions could use some work, some modernization, some other things, but I'm just not a burn it down guy. Like I want to be pragmatic and realize too that even if something is highly imperfect, people rely on it every day. You know what I mean? It's a little bit like you go like, like I've got kids in schools. It's like, hey, do I have an issue with the school? Sure. Sometimes it's like, am I going to be like, let's like tear the school down? It's like, no, unless you have a great replacement, you kind of need. And that's again, one of the problems with this two-party setup is that like, where is the room for the folks to stand up and say something like, hey guys, like, I don't think this Joe Biden thing's a good idea, that was a crazy time when you think about it. And then when it flipped,
insane, then
all of a sudden everyone just like completely forgets about it. And it's like, no one goes back and rewinds the tape to the people who are like, Joe. And then, the next day they're just like, come on.
Yeah, truly. I mean, it's super disappointing. It feels analogous to me of like the way that like the Republicans kind of just fell in line around Trump too.
Yes.
It's the same phenomenon, and I think it's demonstrative to me that we have at least realistically like 4 factions in this country, even if they're not formal parties. And there might be more in common with the 2 factions towards the middle in either party than actually them and their respective fellows in their own larger umbrella under the party system. So
yes, we are a big, diverse, interesting country, and there are definitely more than 2 points of view to be had.
100%. And do you, like, as we go towards this election, are there any specific like demographics or like voter profiles that you're interested to see how they pan out in terms of how they vote? I have a couple.
Oh, well, go ahead and share, please.
I'm curious about the black male vote, and how I wonder if it's changed now that Biden has been swapped out for Kamala, but I did get a pretty considerable sense that when it was a Trump-Biden matchup that Trump was going to gain some ground there. Also very interested about the like Gen Z male vote, because politics are more gendered in my generation than in any prior.
Fascinating.
And
it's true.
I think part of that is social media, but I think part of it too is just like in some ways a reactionary response to growing up in like the era of woke politics that I understand, that I feel like more of my male peers understand than my female peers. I'll be curious to see, because I feel like there is this new like countercultural, it's not actually countercultural anymore to be like take up like climate change as your issue or something. It's countercultural now to kind of like push the buttons of your high school teacher who's like a woke progressive and is offended by everything, and make the un-PC joke or like take back some language that was supposedly beyond the pale. And I do think that there are people that are taking that too far and going way too far right in my generation. But I do think that there is like a large plurality of young boys who are like, yeah, no, we're not going to do this. Like, we're going to do the actual rebellious thing now, which is weirdly to be more conservative today.
That is interesting. I do think that young men, it's going to be fascinating how they vote. I think Latinos and Asians I'm very interested in because the Democratic Party has essentially been like, hey, if you're non-white, you got to vote with us. And like there are a lot of folks, certainly in the Latino community and the Asian American community, like that they're just like not sure if I agree with that. I have, it's like. I mean, a lot of them are voting on the economy and public safety and schools, and then there's a lot of frustration. Well, geez, Rikki, you're making me think that in addition to our now traditional pre-election conversation, like we should go through and talk about afterwards. Hopefully there'll be some good things that we can suss out. Yeah. Some good people win. We avoid some very, very bad outcomes. Maybe some of these states end up fixing the way that they vote. And things can get better. I certainly hope so.
I do too. That's all we can hope for.
Yes. Well, Rikki, how can people keep up with you and your work?
All my social media handles are just Rikki Schlott, my name. And I write for the New York Post from time to time. My book came out last October, The Canceling of the American Mind. And I have a forthcoming podcast in the next week or two, launching within Bill Maher's network and umbrella. So I'm excited to get that out in the world as well.
Yes. Well, as you can tell, Rikki Schlott, very, very reasonable, independent thinking human. And thank you so much for upholding the tradition.
Thank you for having me. It's super fun.